All right, so we're gonna finish up the lecture series, two-part series on the American West with a little bit of a discussion on conflict with Native Americans. So during this time, we start to see this push west of the Mississippi create displacement and conflict between Native American groups before we really start to see this massive conflict between the settlers and the Native Americans. As Native American tribes are displaced, they are forced to confront warring tribes or enemy tribes, tribes that they've been in conflict with. And so I think one thing that we forget is this displacement is going to cause some conflict between Native American groups even before the settlers get out there. In fact, prior to settlement, as explorers had been moving through this territory, it had largely been on peaceful terms with Native Americans between the American explorers and the Native Americans. And this, again, the result of the lack of settlement, right? But as we start to see Americans begin to settle in the West, we're going to see conflict between the settlers and the Native Americans, again, as a result of the displacement. So this is kind of the end of the Indian Wars. So when you talk about the Indian Wars with a historian, you got to be clear on what you're talking about, because this battle between European settlers and Native Americans has been going on as long as European settlers have been in North America. There's been this fighting over resources and territory and sovereignty and control and power that dates back to the 17th century. And as you can see, that it will push forward through into the beginning parts of the 20th century. So right now we're focused on what would be considered kind of the end of the Indian Wars, and this is the west of the Mississippi portion of those Indian Wars. In the post-Civil War period, it gets particularly brutal as the American soldiers begin to use these scorched earth policies that were popular near the end of the Civil War with Northern generals like Sherman and Sherman's march to the sea. And you can see in these pictures that some of the tactics, like Sherman's march, were designed to make sure that the Native Americans could not fight back in the future, right? That they could not build back how they had once been. And so the destroying of buffalo populations, the burning of crops and villages, right? Those were part of those tactics. So there was warring happening out on the West, and it was long and it was brutal. An attempt to end this is the Dawes Act, and the Dawes Act is a political attempt to peaceably solve the problem, the Indian problem in the West. And so the goal of the Dawes Act was really assimilation, right? The United States government passed a law that said we're gonna split up tribal land, and we're gonna give land to individual tribal families and members, and all you got to do is own it privately, not as a tribe, right? No communal ownership. Own it privately, and it's yours, and improve it. It's kind of like the Homestead Act for Native Americans. And then with the land that you don't want or that we don't sell to you, we're going to sell that to white settlers. And a lot of Americans thought, hey, this sounds like a really reasonable and fair plan. But that's ignoring the fact that Native Americans, number one, didn't believe that you could buy and sell land. Number two, didn't want to privately own land, wanted to communally occupy spaces. And so this was really an affront to the culture and longstanding traditions of many Native American tribes. Although it did divide Native Americans within as well. They were divided on this because some saw that there was an end of the traditional ways, and this was the best opportunity to assimilate and move forward, whereas others were committed to those more traditional ways. All right. A tragic event that we'll talk about is kind of defining this period as well is the massacre at Wounded Knee. And the context for this is the rise of something called a ghost dance. You're going to read about this in the textbook. But there was this prophecy among the Western Native Americans at this time that there would be a time when the white settlers were gone, and that the buffalo would come back, and there would be a return to traditional Native American ways. And so there was this dance to celebrate this prophecy that was becoming popular in the West. And the federal government, the United States government, feared that this was a sign of a general uprising. Now, it probably wasn't, but they feared that it was. And so they, at Wounded Knee, opened fire on hundreds of these ghost dancers, killing close to 200 ghost dancers, most of them women and children, really in cold blood, right? It's a massacre, and it's kind of the beginning of the end of Native American culture in the United States and the end of the second era of Indian Wars, right? This kind of west of the Mississippi Indian Wars. So this massacre takes place in 1890. All right, the fighting will continue past Wounded Knee. There will be fighting skirmishes all the way through the 1920s between the United States government and Native American groups in these western states and territories, right? And the lingering question is sovereignty. What happens when the federal government is negotiating with Native American tribes? Does it have to be as a sovereign nation, or can the United States claim all of this territory? So the conflict is going to be ongoing. It's not over yet. We'll talk about a New Deal in the 1930s for Native Americans, some laws that are going to be passed in the 1920s. But for now, just some tragic times of conflict in the American West. All right. Thanks for watching.